The sand tasted like fear. 19 years old, a queen, and a fugitive hiding in the gritty expanse of the Egyptian desert, wrapped in the scratchy wool of a commoner. Her throne in Alexandria wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to her little brother, the 10-year-old Ptolemy XIII, and his council of bitter old men who wanted her head. They whispered her name in the palace halls like a curse. Cleopatra. Too smart, too ambitious, too much like her ancestors who treated sibling rivalry as a blood sport. Every gust of wind sounded like assassin's footsteps. Every night she fell asleep with a knife in her hand, whispering the only prayer that mattered: survival. One day a scout arrived, breathless. His tunic was dark with sweat, his eyes wide with terror and opportunity. "He's here," the scout panted. "In Alexandria, Caesar." Caesar, the butcher of Gaul, the man who was currently burning down the Roman Republic and building an empire from its ashes. Her brother's handlers had made a fatal mistake. They'd murdered Caesar's rival, Pompey, and presented his head as a gift. It wasn't. It was an insult. And now the most powerful man in the world was furious, trapped in her city, and looking for someone to blame. This was it. The moment. Not a threat, a chance. Her advisors told her it was impossible. Caesar was barricaded in the palace. Her brother's army controlled every street, every port, every entry point. She was a ghost in her own kingdom. How could a ghost walk through a wall of swords? She looked at her most trusted servant, Apollodorus, a strange, wild glint in her eye. She commanded, "Get me the finest rug we can find, not to sell, to hide in." The plan was insane, a suicide mission wrapped in silk. Apollodorus argued, pleaded. To be caught was to be executed on the spot. But Cleopatra's mind was already made up. This was how she would reclaim her throne. Not with an army she didn't have, but with a single audacious move that no sane person would ever expect. That night, Apollodorus, a fisherman, heaving a heavy rolled-up carpet on his shoulder, bluffed his way past the Roman sentries. He complained about the weight, about his nagging wife, about the gift he was delivering to the great Caesar. The guards laughed, waved him through. Inside, he unrolled the rug at Caesar's feet. For a moment, nothing. Then the carpet shifted, a cascade of black hair, the glint of gold, and then two eyes, intelligent, defiant, and utterly fearless, stared up at the most powerful man in the world. She had just smuggled herself into the lion's den. What happens when the pawn decides she's the queen? Caesar didn't see a beggar. He saw a thunderbolt. This wasn't a desperate girl. This was a politician who spoke his language: power. She also spoke 9 other languages, a fact Plutarch would later verify, making her the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn the language of her own people. She didn't just ask for his help. She offered him a deal. "Give me my throne, and I will give you the wealth of Egypt, gold, grain, and an alliance that would secure his eastern flank forever." Her brother's forces, realizing they'd been outplayed, laid siege to the palace. For months, Alexandria became a hellscape. The air grew thick with the black smoke of burning ships in the harbor, the acrid smell of priceless knowledge turning to ash as flames licked the edges of the great library. The screams of the dying became the city's new anthem. Trapped inside, Cleopatra and Caesar became something more than allies. They became partners in war, in strategy, in bed. He saw her brilliance. She saw her vulnerability. They talked for hours, their shadows dancing on walls illuminated by torchlight. He spoke of Roman politics, of betrayal and vengeance. She spoke of her family's legacy, a 300-year-old dynasty built on murder and genius. He was 52, a scarred veteran of 100 battles. She was 21, fighting her very first war. Together, they were intoxicating. Together, they were unstoppable. Survival was no longer just a word whispered in the dark. It was a strategy forged in fire. When the dust settled, her brother's body was found at the bottom of the Nile, weighed down by his own golden armor. She was queen, undisputed. But the victory tasted like ash. To secure her crown, she had bound herself to Rome, and she'd made a new, more dangerous enemy. Her own sister, Arsinoe, who had led the rebellion against her. Arsinoe was now Caesar's prisoner, paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. She knew what she had to do. The law of her family was simple: leave no rivals alive. She asked Caesar to execute her sister. It was a cold, calculated request, a moral compromise that stained her soul. He agreed. One whisper from her, and the last of her siblings was dead. She was finally, truly alone on the throne. She bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was her validation, her legacy, her proof that this was more than a fling. This was a dynasty. She followed Caesar to Rome, a foreign queen in the heart of a city that despised kings. They saw her as an exotic pet, a corrupting influence. They called her a whore behind her back. She ignored them. She walked through their city like she owned it. A statue of her placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, an honor that enraged the old guard. She had the man. She had the sun. She had the power. Then, on the Ides of March, 44 BC, it all crashing down. A messenger burst into her Roman villa, his face pale. The words tumbled out, sharp and brutal as the daggers that had delivered them. Caesar, the Senate, stabbed 23 times. He was gone. Her protector, her mentor, the father of her child, the pillar of her world had crumbled into dust. And in the chaos, she wasn't safe anymore. She was the dead dictator's foreign mistress with a son who had a claim to his name. She was a target. She fled Rome in the dead of night, her son in her arms, the city that had hailed her, now a nest of vipers. She had climbed to the top of the world on one man's shoulders. Now the men who killed him were coming for her. The world broke in two. On one side, Caesar's assassins. On the other, his avengers, the cold, calculating Octavian, his adopted son, and the formidable, hard-living general Mark Antony. Cleopatra played the game from afar, rebuilding Egypt's strength, hoarding its wealth. For 3 years, she watched the titans of Rome tear each other apart. Survival meant staying invisible, until she couldn't anymore. The message came from Mark Antony. He had won. The assassins were dead. Now, he was master of the East, and he needed money. He needed ships. He needed her. He summoned her to Tarsus in modern-day Turkey to answer for her supposed lack of support. The tone was not a request. It was a command. Everyone expected a humbled queen to arrive, begging for her kingdom's life. Cleopatra knew this was not an interrogation. It was an audition. and she was not going to play the part of a supplicant. She made Antony wait. Days passed. The powerful Roman general fumed, insulted. Then, one afternoon, a gasp went up from the crowds along the river Cydnus. Something was coming. It wasn't a ship. It was a spectacle, a floating palace. The barge's oars were silver, beating the water in time to ethereal music from flutes and lyres. The sails were a shocking Tyrian purple, a color reserved for royalty. The air for miles grew heavy with the scent of kaifi, an impossibly expensive Egyptian incense. And there on the deck, under a canopy of gold cloth, reclined Cleopatra. She wasn't dressed as a queen. She was dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by handmaidens disguised as sea nymphs. She didn't come to Antony. She sent a message inviting him to a banquet aboard her barge. She hadn't just answered his summons. She had seized control of the entire narrative. Antony, the battle-hardened soldier who had conquered armies, was utterly disarmed. He arrived at her feast to find a world of impossible luxury. 12 rooms, each with its own elaborate theme, the floors littered with roses. The historian Charles-François Lamy noted that the feast was so extravagant, she simply gave all the gold plates and jeweled goblets to Antony's commanders as party favors. This wasn't seduction, this was psychological warfare. He was a Roman general. She presented herself as a living goddess. He wanted to dominate her. She made him her guest. Antony fell, and he fell hard. He followed her back to Alexandria, not as a conqueror, but as a consort. For a year, they lived in a bubble of impossible decadence, creating a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to nightly feasts and revelry. But back in Rome, Octavian watched, and he plotted. He used their love affair as a weapon, painting Antony as a drunken fool enslaved by a foreign witch. He twisted every move they made into an act of treason. Cleopatra, blinded by love or strategy or both, made her boldest and most fatal move. In a grand public ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria, she and Antony sat on golden thrones. She was declared Queen of Kings, her son Caesarion, the King of Kings. They then carved up the eastern territories, some of which Rome didn't even control yet, and gave them to their own children. To Antony, it was a power play. To Cleopatra, it was the ultimate act of survival, securing a future for her dynasty. To Rome, it was a declaration of war. She had gambled that Antony's power could protect her, that their combined strength could build a new empire to rival Rome. She had won his heart, tamed the lion. But in doing so, she had just made an enemy of the entire world. They called her a goddess. She knew she had just signed her own death warrant. The end came at sea. The Battle of Actium, 31 BC. It was a disaster. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant General Agrippa, was smaller, nimbler. Antony and Cleopatra's ships were massive, like floating fortresses, but slow and clumsy. The battle turned into a chaotic slaughter. The air filled with the splintering of wood, the screams of men burning alive, and the stench of blood on salt water. Mid-battle, something snapped. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships suddenly broke from the line and fled. Historians still debate why. Was it a pre-planned escape? Was it cowardice? Or did she see the battle was lost and make a ruthless calculation to save herself and her treasure? Antony saw her leave. In a moment of madness that would doom him forever, he abandoned his men, boarded a small ship, and chased after her. The great general, who had commanded legions, deserted his own battle to follow a woman. His army, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered. The war was over. They returned to Alexandria as ghosts, the city silent and awaiting its new master. Antony locked himself away, drinking, raging, a broken man. Cleopatra began her final preparations. She tested poisons on prisoners, searching for the quickest, most painless death. She built her mausoleum, a grand tomb where she moved all her treasure, gold, silver, pearls, not just to keep it from Octavian, but as a funeral pyre. She sent a message to the approaching victor. If he didn't guarantee the throne for her children, she would burn herself alive with the entire wealth of Egypt. Survival now was about controlling the ending. Octavian's forces stormed the city. A false report reached Antony that Cleopatra was already dead. Screaming her name, he fell on his own sword. But he botched it. The wound was mortal, but slow. His guards, hearing his cries, carried their dying general to the doors of Cleopatra's tomb, where she had barricaded herself. In a scene of pure agony and desperation, Cleopatra and her two remaining handmaidens, Iris and Charmion, refused to open the doors. Instead, they lowered ropes from a window and hoisted the bleeding, dying Antony up the stone walls. He died in her arms, whispering her name. Octavian took the city. He captured Cleopatra. He wanted one thing: to parade her through the streets of Rome in golden chains, the ultimate symbol of his victory. This was her greatest fear: to be a spectacle for the mob, a trophy. Their final meeting was a chess match between two master manipulators. He tried to charm her, promising her mercy. She tried to bargain for her children's lives. She knew he was lying. He saw the same defiance in her eyes that Caesar had seen decades before. He left her under heavy guard, but she had one last move to play. She asked for permission to prepare Antony's body for burial. It was granted. She bathed, dressed in her finest royal robes, and ordered a final feast. A guard brought in a basket of figs, checking it casually. He didn't see the asp hidden beneath the leaves. When Octavian's men broke down the door, it was too late. They found her lying on a golden couch, dead, dressed as the Queen of Egypt. Iris lay dying at her feet. Her other handmaiden, Charmion, was swaying, barely conscious, adjusting the diadem on her queen's head. One of Octavian's soldiers snarled, "A fine thing this, Charmion." With her last breath, she replied, "It is well done, and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings." Then she too collapsed and died. Cleopatra had lost her kingdom. She had lost her love. She had lost her life. But she had won her final battle. She denied Octavian his triumph. Her suicide was not an act of surrender. It was her last perfect act of defiance. her final, ultimate act of survival. Rome wrote the history books. They called her a sorceress, a seductress, a decadent foreign queen who corrupted their heroes. But they could never erase the image of the ruler who outsmarted Caesar, who tamed Antony, and who, in the end, chose a serpent's kiss over a conqueror's chains. She didn't just lose a war, she won immortality.